Welcome to my fifth video about the complete rules of Interstellar, the interplanetary Exodus game by Phil Eklund and Justin Gray. And it's time, finally you might say, to see what happens when the Exodus arrives at its destination. After a journey spanning centuries, your crew arrives in the vicinity of a habitable planet and prepares to land a group of settlers. We know what a habitable planet is since my video number 1. It's either a Goldilocks planet, red or yellow with its name on a yellow pointer, with 2 water symbols, and the required right stuff, nuggets and or domesticated goo. Or maybe it's a troglodyte planet with a blue pointer whose H2O counter matches the planet's symbol, carbon, phoenix or icy moon. And in this case, you need a posthuman on board. And there we are. So we suppose you found such a planet, you've made the journey, and now it's time to land and settle in. Basically, there are 3 ways to set up a colony on an habitable planet. The first is the safe landing, when the Exodus itself arrives in orbit around a habitable planet. Orbiting means with the speed of 0. It stops on the right dot with enough energy to slow down its speed to 0. And if these conditions are met, the game stops immediately. This is mandatory. Players don't have the option of continuing their exploration of other planets. No, the cyborgs were boring on board for centuries and you cannot convince them to stay a few more decades. All the cyborgs from Exodus form your new colony, both the awakened cyborgs and the embryos that will be defrosted later. And that is the classic method. But it cannot be the only method because as it automatically ends the game, it allows you to colonize just one planet, and a single planet, if you remember, is not enough for a major victory. The other methods we are going to see allow you to colonize a planet without ending the game. If you slenderize the jars section, you remember the technique, it's the foam metal maintenance action with the prerequisite of having 3 jars type augmentations on board. And so when you've done that, you discover a new maintenance action, jar pod. The effect of this action, which costs 2 points of fuel, which is a lot, is to detach the entire jar section and land it autonomously on a planet within 4 dots of the Exodus. It doesn't matter how fast the Exodus is. And as it's the entire jar section that's about to land, the blueprint itself disappears with all the attached actions and takes with it all the embryos still frozen in their jars, and all the cyborgs assigned to a work cell card with the jar symbol or in maintenance box on the jar blueprint, such as the cyborg that would have triggered this very jar pod action. But colonization by pod is not without risk. The player trying it must roll a die on the plasma risk table, a table we don't know yet, but I promise we are going to see it a lot during this video. So, only 1 die roll for the whole expedition, and it is called the relativistic pod roll because we've just thrown a sizable chunk of our crew aboard a rather light shuttle at unreasonable speeds. And on this table, we can see that only a result of 1 or 2 has consequences. On a result of 3 or more, all is fine and our colony settles on its new planet. On a result of 1, the little jar symbol means that all embryos are destroyed on landing, and the pebble symbol means that a randomly drawn awakened cyborg will also be killed in the maneuver. So here, it would be between the white and the grey player. And so, in this example, only 1 cyborg would land safely on the new planet. Let's hope it's a woman, because I remind you that you cannot colonize a planet if there isn't at least 1 woman among the colonists. On a result of 2, all aged cyborgs are eliminated. Aged cyborgs are all cyborgs whose card has been flipped, and this happens at age category 5. 1 or 2 is 1 chance out of 3. We'll see later in this video that some technologies can lower the risks a little, but settling a human colony at the other end of the galaxy remains a risky operation. The surviving cyborgs are placed in the Adam and Eve box, and they each earn a medallion for this success, an Adam medallion for men and an Eve medallion for women. There are 2 medallions for each. If there aren't enough for everyone, the chief engineer who performed the jar pod action decides who wins the medallions. The third and final method is represented by 3 work cells, 3 cards with the word pod: eddy brake, the microwave sail, and the push rope. In all 3 cases, a success in the work cell roll releases a pod with 2 cyborgs inside. The 2 cyborgs must be volunteers, and if there are more than 2 volunteers, the chief engineer chooses. Otherwise, except for the smaller number of passengers, it's exactly the same as in the previous case. The card itself acts as a pod, it lands on a planet within a radius of 4 dots, then a roll is made on the plasma risk table on the same relativistic pod line. The surviving cyborgs are placed in the Adam and Eve box and receive their medallions. Okay, but for a newly landed cyborg, the adventure isn't necessarily over. In fact, if the planet on which the cyborgs have landed is perfectly habitable, then that's it. They start their new civilization and you don't have to worry about them until the end of the game. On the other hand, it's still possible to land colonists on a planet that isn't fully habitable. For example, let's suppose you land a shuttle on a planet with this air counter, but you don't own Nugget. In this case, the colony settles anyway, and the cyborgs are placed in the Adam and Eve box. But as long as they don't have all the elements they need to survive, the 2 drops of water and the so-called right stuff, they'll continue to age each turn as if they were still in the ship. And they'll have to pass their attrition roll every turn to avoid dying of old age. That being said, on a planet, people are less stressed. So even if the players have accumulated stress tokens, the cyborgs make their attrition roll at their nominal age without penalty. And then, as soon as the Exodus has found the missing nugget, wherever the Exodus is, the planet becomes 100% habitable and the surviving cyborgs stop aging. The future of their community is secure. As you know, in order to survive on a Goldilocks planet, you need 2 water symbols anyway. And sometimes you'll come across a planet with only 1. Fortunately, there's a solution for bringing water to places where there isn't enough. And that's the Dropstone maintenance action found on the Slenderized version of the battery's blueprint. Here, the idea is to collect a chunk of ice as large as possible, floating in space, and drop it toward the planet's surface. The operation consumes 1 point of fuel, and be careful because the Exodus must be in orbit around the planet to perform this action. Thus, if this increase in water makes the planet habitable, as the Exodus is in orbit around it, that means with a speed of 0, this immediately ends the game. Okay, now let's summarize all the maintenance actions you can find on the blueprints. You know the 5 basic actions, 1 on each of the 5 blueprints. Ignite the engines, recharge the batteries, decant an embryo to create a new cyborg, launch a wisp to explore the surrounding planets, or finally, prospect a nugget stuck in the ship's nose. That's the basics, but each blueprint has a second action which is in fact 5 times the same foamed metal. Each time it requires 3 identical augmentations that match the blueprint to be slenderized. The effect of foam metal is to flip the blueprint on its other side and turn it vertically. The player who makes this action can always choose to add a shield to the front of the ship. Usually he adds his own shield, but he doesn't have to. He can add another player's shield. Now, on each blueprint in its slenderized version, there is the same main action as on the other side, but with a lower energy cost. Slimming down a blueprint always makes its action more efficient, except for batteries, whose recharge action is exactly the same on both sides. And then each slenderized section gets a new original action. Some of them we already know. The battery's Dropstone action lets you add 1 point of water to a planet to make it habitable. The jar pod action lets you jettison the entire jar section like an autonomous shuttle to colonize a planet. The life support outbreak action allows you to trigger a goo invasion on a blueprint of your choice. You do this action when you feel that you are able to domesticate the goo and need it to terraform planets' atmospheres and make them habitable. And so there are still 2 actions that we don't know yet. Aerogel refuel on the engine blueprint gives 1 point of fuel if the Exodus is in orbit, that means at speed 0, around a gas giant. Gas giants can be identified by this symbol, the planet with rings around it. And so, for example, the Exodus can gain fuel by orbiting here. And by staying for several turns, it could even refill its tank with a rate of 1 point per turn. And finally, the Dustbug action on the Warden's section. The player who takes this action can place a Dustbug token, a weird snail-shaped wooden token, on an LIC dot, a cloud of particles, or on a flare stare or debris disk dot, or on an habitable Goldilocks planet with the right stuff and water, and only within a range of 4 dots. Fine. And once the Dustbug is installed, what does it do? The Dustbug is a robot that can be sent out ahead of the ship to clean up anything that might represent a hazard, dust, pieces of rock, and so on. Once positioned, the Dustbug stays where it is, and if at some point, even a long time later, the Exodus enters its dot, if it's an LIC, a cloud of particles, nothing happens. The cloud doesn't destroy any blueprint, and it doesn't generate a nugget. On the other hand, the Dustbug itself is eliminated. If it's a flare stare or debris disk, the ship gets a bonus of +1 on the die roll needed to resolve the situation. We'll see later how to resolve these situations. In both cases, the Dustbug remains in orbit and its modifier can still be used. And finally, and this is one of Interstellar's finest rules, if the Dustbug reaches a habitable Goldilocks planet, that means with the 2 water symbols nuggets and domesticated goo, then the Dustbug is considered to be spreading dust on the planet's surface, which may later lead to the appearance of microscopic life. And guess what? This is a bridge to the game Bios-Genesis, and this can trigger a potentially infinite loop of all Bios and High Frontier games. Wow, this is Phil Eklund at his best. But then, what does it change for our interstellar mission? Well, it gives the Panspermia medallion, so a few victory points, and note that this medallion is lost if the planet is eventually colonized by humans or post-humans. Finally, note that there are only 2 Dustbug tokens available, so if you take a Dustbug action while the 2 are already in use, you can retrieve one and place it elsewhere. And these are all the maintenance actions which are linked to the ship's blueprints, all except the two shields actions. Once a player has added a shield to the front of the ship after slenderizing one of the blueprints, remember we do this to protect the ship from particle clouds, the LICs, well, the shield also adds two new actions. The first, jettison, is simply to get rid of the shield if you no longer need it. With this action, the shield is returned to his owner's mat, yellow player in our example. And you cannot do this just to bother yellow player by cluttering up his mat, since this action is only possible with the agreement of the player who owns the shield. Second action, the electromagnetic shield. It costs a lot in battery, 4 points, but it gives a bonus to all the risk rolls for the current turn. That is, all the rolls on this table. This includes landing attempts when colonizing a planet, as we've just seen, but also flying through a flare star or debris disk, or slowing down without igniting the engines by using an Oort cloud or a flyby, and we will see what that means right away. In short, if you're planning a high-risk turn, why not invest these 4 battery points to avoid the worst? Fine, shields are very useful, I understand, but there are situations when you prefer not to build a shield when slenderizing the ship. At the beginning of the game, all the blueprints are horizontal and the ship weighs 400 tons. It's written here, it's very small because the exact value isn't so important. And then, every time a player slenderizes it with a foamed metal action, if he adds a shield to the front of the ship right away, it doesn't change the total mass of 400 tons. But if he chooses not to add a shield, or if the shield is destroyed later by a particle cloud, then the ship is a little shorter and therefore lighter. And if you go on and slim down all the blueprints, you halve the total mass of the Exodus to 200 tons and then immediately apply what's written here on the board. The ship commander must either change the speed by 1, accelerate by 1 or slow down by 1, or he keeps his speed but moves the Exodus forward 1 dot on the map. Note that at this stage it's no longer possible to add shields to the ship because the action that can add a shield is the foamed metal action, which is no longer available on this side of the blueprints. So, slenderizing the ship is fine, but don't forget that it removes all shield protection. Then, after flying through particle clouds or being attacked by goo, the Exodus can still lose sections. And with 3 sections left, he reaches 120 tons and can again change his speed by +1 or -1, or keep the same speed and move forward 1 more dot on the map. And if he's down to just 1 section, 40 tons, he can change his speed 1 last time or move forward 1 dot. It may seem an extreme situation, but your plan may be to take advantage of these speed modifications to arrive at speed 0 in orbit on your destination planet. And be warned, this isn't easy to achieve because there is no action to destroy blueprints at will. None except one, the outbreak action, which creates goo so you can let it quietly devour your blueprints. And that's why, in my example, the last blueprint I've kept is life support with this outbreak action. Now let's take a look at some tools you can use to change the Exodus speed. Speed is important because you want to accelerate enough so that the journey doesn't last too long, because you know that your cyborg's life expectancy isn't infinite. And you also want to be able to slow down when necessary to end at speed 0 in orbit around your destination planet. So, In order to accelerate, there are only two solutions. You've got to ignite your engine, or you've got to slenderize your ship, as we've just seen. And think about it. This means you need to keep some fuel in your tanks to be able to accelerate. Fuel is super important, and you need to know how to recover fuel. We'll see that right after. In order to slow down the ship, there are a few more options. You can ignite your engine or slenderize your ship. Okay, these always work. But you can also use the Oort ice clouds. These are the same dots with a little arrow in which you could do distant observation with a wisp thanks to the gravitational lens effect, dots called sun lens. Well, if the Exodus fly through such a dot, no need to stop there. The commander can decide to attempt a Oort icebreaking maneuver. For a cost of 1 battery point, the ship loses 1 point of speed. Note that the slowdown only takes place at the end of the turn and does not change the current movement. So it works and the ship slows down, but immediately afterwards, the commander must make a roll on the risk table on the Oort icebreaking line. And this is very dangerous because the only way to go on safely is to get a 6. With a 1, the Exodus loses its two foremost blueprints. They both generate a nugget, okay, but you'd better have planned this ahead by building 2 shields because yes, you can add up several shields at the front of the Exodus. But there's more. All work cell cards on board with this symbol are discarded. These experiments are sensitive to ionizing radiation. And the last symbol means that all awake cyborgs on board die. On a result of 2, it's the same, but you only lose 1 blueprint. On a result of 3, the ship loses 1 awakened cyborg, chosen at random, and all frozen embryos. 4, all aged cyborgs are lost. That means all cyborgs whose card is already flipped, so all cyborgs whose age is greater than or equal to 5. And finally, on a result of 5, all radiation-sensitive cards are lost. Yes, you understand, you'd better think twice before trying an Oort icebreaking maneuver. There's a second sporty way to lose speed. It's called flyby, since the maneuver consists in flying very close to a planet, flyby, to use the friction of its atmosphere to slow down. And it's dangerous because it heats up, and that's why the word fly became fry. And this method works exactly like the previous one. The only difference is that instead of taking place on a Oort cloud, the Exodus must fly through a system with either a gas giant, a white dwarf, or a brown dwarf. For example, this system, Sirius A and B, allows a flyby because there is both a gas giant and a white dwarf. The risks are also slightly different because the commander rolls on another line. I won't go through all possible results again, just this one we don't know yet. On a roll of 1, we get a little yellow flash symbol, which means the ship loses 1 blueprint that is replaced by a nugget, but this blueprint is selected at random from all the ship's blueprints. So it's hard to protect against that, even with shields. Given the danger involved, you should use these 2 last methods only in critical situations. And to close on the subject of the Exodus speed, there's one last detail I need to tell you. When a player performs the engine ignition action on the engine blueprint, if the amount of fuel is 65 or less, 4 units of fuel or less, the commander can perform a double delta V, which means spending 2 fuels at once to change the speed by 2 in order to accelerate or to slow down. This is shown just below the fuel gauge, and it's not the same as doing the ignition action twice, because thanks to the double delta V, you only pay 2 battery points and the crew only suffers 1 stress. And now here's a trick for recovering fuel. It's a trick that uses dust bugs. It's called Zeppelin refuel. Remember, dust bugs are the snail-shaped robots that can be launched with the Warden's Blueprint maintenance action and can clean up before the Exodus arrives to reduce the hazards. Well, if the Exodus itself is in orbit around a gas giant, at speed 0 on the same dot as one of those big planets with rings, it can send a dust bug there with domesticated goo. That means that the player performing the dust bug action must have a domesticated goo marker on his own mat. And then, here is the magic trick. The action adds 1 unit of fuel to the ship, and in addition, the player can add a shield to the front of the ship. What actually happened is that the ship installed a flying refinery in the planet's atmosphere. And by the way, if the engine blueprint is flipped to its vertical side, the Aerogel refuel action is available. And if players manage to activate both the Zeppelin Dustbug and the Aerogel, since in both cases the ship must be orbiting a gas giant, the Exodus gains 2 points of fuel at once. And that's it, we are done with maneuvers, and I agree that this topic was a little difficult to grasp, but I promise that from now on, there's nothing more complex. Okay, now what happens, on the other hand, if there's no human still awake on board? Such a situation is quite possible and even probable, given the length of the journey. At some point, the commander can die with no humans left on board but frozen embryos. This situation is called the ghost ship. In this case, the commander star remains in its last position on the political hexagon to show which ideology was the last to command the ship, so this player will continue to make all navigation decisions even with only avatars on board. But since machines are less efficient than humans, especially in the face of adversity, all risk rolls are doubled. So for example, if the ship flies through a flare star, the commanding avatar must roll the die twice on that line, applying the result each time. Worse than that, if these humans, who represent the totality of humanity and its knowledge, remain in their hibernation jars for too long, their knowledge will begin to fade. And so, at the end of each round during the reset phase, in which no cyborg is awake, each ideology and therefore each player suffers one glitch. A glitch is a regression. The player must discard an augmentation or a domesticated goo or a nugget. And if his ideology has nothing to discard, it discards nothing. To sum it up, it's not a good idea to leave the Exodus with no one at the helm. And now, a word about agenda cards. This is an optional rule, so you don't have to play with it, but I'd recommend it because it makes your crew's chance of survival a little more flexible. At the beginning of the game, the commander randomly draws one of the 5 agenda cards. The 4 remaining cards are set aside and not used at all. The commander is the only one who can look at this card. It represents some kind of secret technology entrusted to her by the governments of Earth, just in case. And all 5 possible agenda cards look the same. It's a work cell card, the commander has it in her hand, and on her turn, with the standard research action, she can put it into play on a player's board. So it's just like a standard research action, except that she plays the card from her hand instead of getting it from the ID marketplace. Then, the card stays there and all players can put their cyborgs or avatars to work on it. Beware, this is a dangerous tool. A cyborg who rolls a 6 is immediately killed. But it's a powerful tool. Look at this agenda card. If the work cell roll is successful, until the end of the turn, all planets attached to a white dwarf are considered habitable. And all agenda cards work the same. They make a specific type of planet habitable for the duration of one turn. So your job is to land a colony right on the turn on which the experiment is successful. And as long as the commander hasn't played this card with a search action, she's the only one who knows its secret. If another player becomes the commander, he takes the card and can also look at it. And then, gradually, the secret will be shared between several players. But what's the point of keeping it a secret? It's because you never know. You can never be sure that at the end of your journey, a post-human, for example, will appear and the last humans on board will be happy to have that information that the enemy won't have. And finally, before the end of this video, I'd like to talk about the dangers that await you in space. LICs, local interstellar clouds, are the particle clouds we already know so well. When the Exodus flies through an LIC dot, it loses its foremost blueprint. If you are efficient enough, this blueprint can be a shield, and it is replaced by a nugget from the cosmos. This makes the LIC a danger, yes, but a necessary one, because it's the only way to get the nuggets out of the cosmos. Then there are flare stars and debris disks, which work in much the same way. In both cases, as soon as the Exodus enter their dot, the commander must roll a die on the risk table. The line you roll on depends on the hazard, and debris disks are generally less dangerous than flare stars. In both cases, the collision can destroy one or more blueprints, creating nuggets, so it's still a way of getting nuggets, but it's very random and very dangerous. In the case of debris disks, there's a funny technique called the vacuum cleaner. If you remember this from video number 2, when the Exodus wants to slow down, it turns its engines forward, and the blast from these engines clear the space in front of it. And so, if in the same turn it enters a dot with a debris disk, it doesn't make any risk roll. Fine, but this doesn't work with flare stars. Then there are the antimatter jets. These are not dangerous as the previous hazards, quite the opposite in fact. When the Exodus enters such a dot, the study of antimatter allows the crew to understand a great deal about how the physics of the universe work. In game terms, when the ship enters such a dot, the commander can peek at one nugget already out of the cosmos. So, we are talking about nuggets that have already been generated by a collision with an LIC, so they are either in space at the front of the ship or on a player's mat. They are no longer in the cosmos and they are still face down. This gives just a little more information to the commander. And since there's been a lot of talk about disasters destroying blueprints, I think we should recap everything that happens when a blueprint is destroyed, whether by a space hazard or a goo attack. So, when a blueprint is destroyed, most likely the blueprint at the front of the ship, but not always, the first thing we do is eliminate all the characters working on that blueprint. Then, all work cells whose symbol matches this blueprint are also eliminated, thus discarded, and all cyborgs and avatars who were working on these work cells are also eliminated. Finally, the marketplace column that matches that same symbol is also removed from the game. It will no longer be possible to research and work on these experiments. Okay, but we already knew all that. Now, there are two special cases to look at: the destruction of the jars and the destruction of the life support. These two blueprints are linked to two sections on all players' mats. The jars correspond to the first section, the leftmost one, and the life support to the middle section. And so if the life support blueprint is destroyed for whatever reason, all the work cells in the center section of all players' mats are eliminated, along with all the characters assigned to them, even if these work cells don't have the life support symbol. Note that this is why it's so important to leave avatars and cyborgs where they are even after they've completed their action, as this location can be their tomb if the blueprint they're in is destroyed later in the same turn. The same applies to the jar's blueprint. Destroying it means eliminating the first section of all players' mats, and it means also the loss of the jars themselves, so all the frozen embryos remaining in stock. The loss of the jar's blueprint means the loss of the last remains of humanity. In other words, if possible, it's something to avoid.